are up to, we are up to Das. But at the end of yesterday, we sort of were rushing a little bit. So I want to just go back a little bit to Volvam and Bays to remind ourselves we were talking about. So what ended up happening is Rav stated an opinion to clarify Ben Beseira. Ben Beseira said that if the avodah was done biyat smoil, if the kmitza was done biyat smoil, you could just put the kmitza back into the main container and do the kmitza again. Well, there was a question of what if you already made the kmitza out of the main container and you already placed it into another klei. Would that be a cutoff line? So the Gemara ended up bringing a machlokes tanaim about that, what Ben Beseira's opinion is. Meaning, do you say even if you place the kmitza into the secondary klei, you can still do it over? Or only if the kmitza is still in the hand of the person that was puzzled, did the kmitza psula, then he could put it back into the original klei, but otherwise he cannot. Once he placed it into its own klei, it's past the point of no return. So the Gemara wanted to know, my kasavri hani tanoi. The tanoim will hold that it's the point of no return is placing the kmitza into the second klei. Ika mitzas psulun avodahi. If the kmitza itself is an avodah, so then that avodah was done bipsul, and it's already irrevocable. So why do you need to place it into the keli, into the next klei to make it irrevocable? And ikmitzas psulin is a lav avodahi, and if the kmitza is not an avodah, so what is putting it into the keli help? Ki avodah lematan kli my help. Hadar Amar Rab Nachman lo avodahi. Sure, the kmitza is an avodah, but the problem is the avodah is an extended avodah. It's not merely making the kmitza, rather than like gamra avoidasa ada avodah lematan kli. The act of kmitza is a twofold act. You make the kmitza and you put it into the secondary klei, that finalizes it. And yes, once that avodah is complete, it's irrevocable and you can't have a do-over. Frek the Gemara ihachi afilu loy kidesh. It should be irrevocable even if you didn't put it into a secondary klei. Because where did you put it? You put it back into the main pot. Well, guess what? The main pot is also a klei. So therefore, that should also complete the avodah of kmitza, and therefore it should be possible. Thank you very much. Shmaka, I want coffee. When you put something into a klei, it's only going to give the item that you placed into kedusha if you placed the item in that klei with the intent that the klei should give it kedusha. So therefore, when he places the kmitza back into the main klei with the rest of the mincha, he's doing it with the express kavana of it not being an avodah, of it not being mekadosh, because he wants to roll the clock back and be able to do the kmitza again. Zok Gemara, so how midas mekachin? Are you telling me that when you put something into a klei, it's even though it's wrong, it's still going to be mekadosh? This very issue was discussed, and Rish Lakish asked this shayla of Rabbi Yochanan, and this is the question that he asked: Klei ma'u sheyiktishu psulin lechatchila likarev. And Rashi says, "Kagoin im kamat zar." Our case exactly. The kmitza was done by a zar, pasal kmitza, the noisin lekli, and he put it into a klei, but it's a pasal kmitza. Ma'u sheyaktishenu kli laktiroi. Will the klei be makbishit that now you should be able to place it on the mizbeach? Now, if it's a puzzle, how would that work? So could be we're talking about the concept of im olu lo yerdu. Maybe the Gemara once had a shayla if the klei also has a din of a mizbeach. So maybe once you placed it into the klei, even though you should not have, because it was a kmitza psula, because it was done by a zar, but maybe at this point you should be makrivit. Well, Amr Lay, And Rabbi Yochanan answered, Ein mekachin. It will not be mekadosh, meaning you're not allowed to be makriv. Ein mekachin. So the problem is, how could you tell me that this is that a klisharis is mekadesh midas? Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan had a shaila, and Rabbi Yochanan told him that it's not mekadesh. So how could you tell me it would be mekadesh? Zok to Gemara, Omer Lei. So he answered back, Ein mekachin likorev. Yes, Rabbi Yochanan paskin that the klisharis is not mekadesh, the kmitza that was done b'psul, but that means not that it should be machshurit to now tell us to place it on the mizbeach. Aval mekachin lifoso, but it does complete the kmitza, the action of kmitza, that now it's possible and it's irrevocable. As Rashi says, liposo, the kava hahi kli b'kedusha, the keli that the kmitza was placed into, crystallized it b'kedusha, ki avina adai l'kedusha, if that's what he put it in there for, and therefore v'leimoti la'adu rasula soicha shirayim, you can no longer place the kmitza back into the main pot and have a do-over. The apostle zeh gomar l'chula avodah. The base change the law. If still zeh gomar l'chula. Basically, the avoid of the kmitza has been completed b'psul, and it would be irrevocable. Let's go back to our original kasha. The Gemara asked, Tiktosh v'livsa. Even if you're not going to place the kmitza into a second klei, and you're just going to place it back into the main mincha to do it over, but the main mincha was in the klei. So when you place that kmitza back even into that keli, by placing it into a klei, it should seal the kmitza, and now it should be irrevocable. That was the Gemara's kasha right at the top of Amud. So the Gemara's first eretz was that a klei will not be mekadesh shaloi midas. But Rav Amram wanted to say a different svara. Even if you held a klisharis will be mekadesh shaloi midas, here it wouldn't work when you put it back into the keli. You know why? Because it was speaking where the keli was heaping and overflowing. So when you put the kmitza back, you're not putting it back into the keli, you're technically putting it on the keli, because it's on top of the mound that's protruding above the rim of the keli. So therefore, it's not inside the klisharis. So that's the teretz. You could put back the kmitza because then it won't be in the klisharis. And if it's not in the klisharis, it doesn't seal the kmitza, and therefore you could redo it. Amar lei, Amar Kagayin, so Levisa Gedusha, you put it on to a klisharis that was heaping, and therefore the kaimitz is technically not inside the keli. Frank the Gemara, so then how did you originally make the kmitza if it was heaping? Umekamitz, heichi kamitz. You never made a kmitza out of a klisharis, because you're telling me that the cases where it's heaping over and above the level of the keli. As Rashi says, the chimiyahadar lekamitz. Oh, that's before. Umekamitz, heichi kamitz. Betchila, how did you make the original kmitza? Kishekamitz mechlizeh. How did you do it? You're just telling me now that speaking where it's heaping over. We know that when you make kmitza, it has to be from inside the keli, not from a heap that's sticking above the level of the keli. It has to be within the walls of the keli. Ella, you know what the case is? It was flat when you made the kmitza. Now you took the kmitza out. Now there's a hole in the center where you took the kmitza out. Now when you put the kmitza back, being the keli is filled to the top, you didn't put it directly into that hole. You put the kmitza on the side, around the area around the hole. So now that kmitza is sticking above the level of the keli. So you put it on the klei sharis, but not in the klei sharis. And you didn't put it into that hole. So it was exactly level to the top of the keli. Frank, I don't understand. Even the comments lay, how did he make the kmitza? He took some out. So there's a hole there. So over leguma, if there's a hole there, kimahader legavei the kimahader legavei the manakamadle. So when he's putting it back, it's going into the hole. What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? It's on top of the hole. It's in the hole because that's you'll put the kmitza back where you took the kmitza from. He doesn't place the kmitza right back into the hole that he took the kmitza out of. He actually puts it around where there's no indentation, there's no kmitza done. So there's room in the middle for the kmitza, let's say, kind of like a 2 or 3 inch square, but all the way around it's a much bigger keli. There's part of the surface of the flour that had not been touched. That's where you'll put the kmitza back. So when you put the kmitza back, it's above the level of the keli. Now, if you want to make another kmitza, how are you going to fix that? Because umanidle, if you shake it, it's going to sort of even out. So first you put the kmitza back on top of the flour that now is protruding above the level of the keli, and then you shake it so it should even out. Umanidle v'nafal mamela. So the problem is, so why isn't that considered like you put it back into the klisharis? Because it's the nasa kamishech sirei hakoif. If you didn't directly place it into the keli, you placed it on top, and indirectly by shaking it, it levels off. That we don't look at like anybody put it into the klisharis. If anybody put it into the klisharis, it would be mekadosh. But you look at it like it happened by itself, like a monkey did it. Let's have a look at Rashi. Ki mahadele adofnisa demana. Bitside akli, around the edges of the keli, eitzel guma, around the hole that was made when he took the kmitza out. Chsira, that's where he put it back. V'hava kegodush hakli. Now it's going to be above the level at the top of the keli. So when you placed the kmitza back, in fact, you didn't place it into the keli, you placed it on top of the keli. V'naidi lemana, then you shake the keli. V'nofel kaimitz memela leguma, and then it'll sort of level off. So the kaimitz will end up filling the hole, and now it will be within the walls of the keli. So that kadesh royu lekmitza skoyin, so that you can do the second kmitza, the kosher kmitza. Now is the punchline. The chivan de memela nofel lemana, since you didn't specifically place it into the keli, it just fell in there as you were shaking the keli. So it sort of happened by itself. Nasa kamish chsirei hakoif. It's as if a monkey put it back. V'loy mikdash loy kli. There, the keli doesn't make it kodesh, because only if it's a human putting it back there, putting it back into the keli. But if it's not a human, it just happened like a monkey does it, or it just happens by itself when you shake it. Af al gav the klisharis mekachin shaloi midas. Even though a klisharis can be mekadesh, even if you don't want it to be mekadesh, hanamili ki mehader leiu mamish adated de liktish. If he himself is placing the kmitza in the keli with the intent that it shouldn't be mekadesh to kmitza, there we say it doesn't help. The klisharis is mekadesh even shalom midas mekadesh lei. Mekadesh lei the klisha mechsir ben shamuch hagavech. That's right. So I'll go upon them. So we have a weird hechatimsa where you could put the kmitza back in. You took the kmitza out from within the keli, so it was a proper kmitza. When you put it back in, you put it back on the keli. And how do you do the second kmitza? Because by itself it's going to level off, and now the second kmitza will also be from within the keli. Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Correct Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Zera. The lukma. Why don't we have a different teretz? What was the kasha? The kasha was even putting the kaimitz back into the original keli, that should be mekadesh the kmitza. So we had two terutzim. We had the first teretz that it's not mekadesh shleimidas. We had Rabbi Yirmiyah's teretz that it's speaking where you didn't place the kmitza into the keli, you placed it on the keli and then settled down. But now Rabbi Yirmiyah suggests a third svara. The lukma kagoyin shechsirei lekli hamunich al gabe karka. Maybe if the kohen wasn't holding the keli is just sitting on the ground, maybe that's not considered properly placing it into the klisharis. So maybe the klisharis is only mekadesh the kmitza if the klisharis is being held by a kohen. But if it's just on the floor, maybe that wouldn't be mekadesh it. Why didn't the Gemara offer up that teretz? Ella shemamina. From the fact that the Gemara didn't offer that teretz, it tells us quite clearly that even though the klisharis is on the floor, it would be mekadesh, and the kohen does not have to be holding the klisharis. The keli that the mincha is in doesn't have to be held by a kohen. It could be on the floor or on a table, and you can make the kmitza out of that, and that will be a valid kmitza, and that's why the Gemara didn't offer this up as a teretz that you did kmitza me'al gab karka, because in fact kmitza me'al gab karka is perfectly fine. So now we opened up a whole new discussion of when you make kmitza out of a keli, does that keli have to be held by somebody, or can that keli be sitting on a table or sitting on the floor? So our Gemara here is concluding that even if the keli that the kamitz is taken out of, even if it's just sitting on a table or on the floor, that's fine. It doesn't have to be held by somebody. And that's going to be the remainder of today's daf, this Shiloh.
Somebody's a coin.
Well, yeah, somebody would have to be a coin because all the bodies have to be a coin, which the Gemara is going to bring out very well, very nicely. So Zokt Gemara, now that you ventured into this area, Kanogus beboya the boyalam. Now you've already entered a new domain about a discussion about Kaims and Michli Shagabi Karka. And this is an old discussion. And now we have a fascinating story to lead into this discussion. The Rebbe Avimai, Tani Menachos, Bei Rav Chisda. Rav Avimai learned Mesechus Menachos by Rav Chisda. The Avimai, Bei Rav Chisda, Tani? If you're telling me that Rav Avimai learned Menachos by Rav Chisda, it would connotate that Rav Chisda was the Rebbe of Avimai. But in fact, the opposite was true. Avimi Bei Rav Chisda, Tani? Punkt verkehrt. Rav Chisda was the Talmud of Rav Avimai. How do I know? Because of a story. The Amr Rav Chisda once said, Kol v'tavi bola me'avimai. Did I get petch? I got beaten up really bad from Avimai because of a certain halacha that I was struggling to understand. Zokt Rashi, Kol v'tavi hakoyis toivis. I got some good petch. It doesn't literally mean petch. Rashi's bolim Avimai, bolati, I had to swallow from Avimai. He put me in the chayrim. So he was really, really tough on me. He was really, really tough on me. Let me just look up the Oishchav test to see if the Shita Kumetzes changes Menada. So you're Makos. I used to hit him. So Reb Chisda said, I got petch from my Rebbe, Rav Avimai, because of the following Allah. Now, what the halach is, if they have to liquidate the assets of Yisayimim in a trust to give them money to live, they have to make sure that they're going to acquire the maximum price for the product that they're selling, usually karka. Now, in order to do that, it has to be very, very well advertised. So the more people that you reach out to and you market this piece of property to, the more money you'll bring in for it. So the halach is, if you're going to make announcements about this property that was for sale, in those days they didn't have newspapers, they didn't have internet websites, they didn't have TREB, the Toronto Real Estate Board. So they just made an announcement in the public square on the soapbox. So if they would announce daily, this property is for sale, it would be enough to do this for 30 days, and then after 30 days, they would be able to make the sale. But what if they only made the announcements on Mondays and Thursdays? Sheni v'chamishi. Do you have to wait for 30 occurrences? No. But samach yomi, you'd have to wait 60 days. And Rashi says if you count up the amount of Mondays and Thursdays in 60 days, it would work out to 16 announcements. It would work out to 18 announcements. It would work out to 18 announcements. So let's say 60 days is how many weeks? 6 times 7, 60 days is 7 times 10 is 70, 7 times 9 is 63, 7 times 8 is 56. So 8 weeks times 2 is 16, plus there's an extra 2 days there, so it works out to 18 times. So if you're spreading it out over 60 days, 18 times would be enough. So for this halacha, I guess Avima, I couldn't remember it. Rashi's Nishkachim. Rashi doesn't say what happened. Chisda had difficulty understanding this. It doesn't say in Rashi exactly what his difficulty was, but he was having difficulty understanding. Right. So there was a stira. One Rashi is at 30 days, one's at 60 days, and we didn't know Pshat in the stira. And Avima, he said, Pshat in the stira is 60 days if it's only 2 days a week. 30 days if it's 30 consecutive days. And for some reason, Reb Chisda kept on forgetting this pshat that Avimai said. And that's why Avimai was beating him up. So I'll call upon them from this story. You clearly see that Reb Chisda was the Talmud and Avimai was the Rebbe. So how could you tell me that Avimai learned Meseches Menachos in the yeshiva of his Talmud, Reb Chisda? Zogt Gemara, a beautiful halacha. Avimai Mesechta is Akra. He forgot. Avimai was the Rebbe, and he forgot a Mesechta. He forgot Menachos. So what he did was he went to learn it by his Talmud. He went to his Talmud, Lat Kure Gomri, to remind him, to teach him the Gemara again. Fragt Gemara, is that appropriate? If anything, why would Avimai the Rebbe go to Reb Chisda? Since Reb Chisda was the Talmud, wouldn't it have been more appropriate for Avimai to summon Reb Chisda so Reb Chisda could teach him the Masechta? Zok to Gemara, Savar Hachi Mistaya Milzatvei. If you want to learn and you want to steig in learning, you have to pull rank off. And you have to be mevatel yourself to the person you want to learn from. As Rashi says, Mistaya Milza, Bishim Yagati Umatsasi. You have to have Yigia. So it's mashma from Rashi, I would say, that this is not about what I said, that when you want to learn, you have to lower yourself to somebody. No. Rashi says that Yagati Matsasa. There's a benefit in traveling and putting yourself out and inconveniencing yourself to learn. It'll give you a bigger shot to the Shmaya. Because you got him as Yosy. It's Yigia. To have Reb Chisda come to him is not Yigia. But for him to have to schlep and to travel to Reb Chisda, that's Yigia. He felt if I extend that Yigia, it will help me understand the Gemara better. Frek the Gemara. So this is the story. So you have now Avimai the Rebbe learning in the yeshiva Reb Chisda. And somehow, while he was going to the yeshiva, while he was at the yeshiva, Paga Bei Rav Nachman. So this whole story was a tangent. Now we're getting back to the sugya. He met Rav Nachman. So Avimai met Rav Nachman. Amar Lei, and he asked Rav Nachman, Keitzat Koimsin, how do you make chametza? Amar Lei, Michlizeh. So Rav Nachman pointed to a keli that was sitting on the ground, and he said, from this keli, which would indicate that nobody has to be holding the keli, even if the keli is on the ground. Amar Lei. So Avimai asked Rav Nachman, the chikoimtzin mechlish al gabe kaka. Could you make chametza from a keli that's on the faucet, that's on the floor? So Rav Nachman said, no. Amar Lei de makbele koyin, like Rav Shimon said, it has to be a koyin. He just means this type of keli. But avada, it has to be held by a koyin. Beautiful. Now this is not like what we said earlier, because we said earlier we wanted to bring a raya from the fact that the Gemara didn't say it was Agabe Karka. It's a raya that even Agabe Karka you can make a Kamitza, but that's not what Rav Nachman said. Rav Nachman and Rav Hima seem to have said that the Keli cannot be Agabe Karka, the coin has to be holding. Keitat Mekachin Es HaMenachos. When the donator of the carbon brings his mincha to the Beis HaMikdash, so he brings it in his own container. How are we mekalish it? By placing it into a klisharis when he arrives at the Beis HaMikdash. So how do you do that? Amalei Rav Nachman said, Noisna lechlize. Again, he pointed to the keli on the floor and said, just put it in there. So Freik the Gemara, the chimekachin bechli shalgabe karka. Once again, you're going to tell me the klisharis that you're sitting on the ground or sitting on a table without anybody holding it. You're going to tell me by putting the mincha into it. That'll be mekalish it. Once again, Rav Nachman answered, Amar Lei the magvela koyin. The koyin has to be holding it. So now we're talking about two events, because there's three things that occur in the mincha. The first thing that occurs is the bailam comes with the flour and oil in their own container and places it into the klei sharis. We just learned from Rav Nachman that when the bailam places it into the klei sharis, that klei sharis has to be held by a koyin, right? Then we learned that the keli that the kohen makes the kamitza out of has to, when he makes the kamitza out of it, again, somebody has to be holding that keli, right? But there's a third thing that we're going to have to still clarify. Once the kohen made the kamitza, and now he has to put it into the second keli, what is that? Does that keli have to be held by a kohen, or could that keli be on the ground? And that's really the discussion that we're having here. Because in our case, the whole question was, if you made the kamitza already, Apostle Azor made kamitza, and he placed it into the Klesharis, and the Gemara wants to say that since the Klesharis was on the ground, it wasn't being held by anybody, that's why it wasn't a good Kmitza. It's not a complete Kmitza. And the Gemara rejected that. And the Gemara said, no, Vais Techois, if you placed the Kmitza into a Keli that was on the ground, it wouldn't be a completed Kmitza. But we haven't discussed that yet with Reb Nachman. With Reb Nachman, we discussed originally bringing the Kmitza, and we discussed when the Kmitza is made out of a Keli as well. So in both cases, when you bring the Kmitza, when you bring the whole Mincha to the Kohen, and you're pouring into the Klesharis, there, the Kohen has to be holding the Klesharis. And when you take the Kmitza out, when the Kohen takes the Kmitza out, again, that has to be held. The container has to be held by a Kohen. So, Frank the Gemara, Amar Lei, Im Kain, if you're going to tell me that whenever the Kohen makes a Kmitza or pours the flour from the Balabais into the Klesharis, that Keli has to be held by a Kohen. So, Im Kain, Utzrachto Gimel Kayanim. You'd actually need 3 Kayanim to do the Mincha. One Kohen to hold the Klesharis that the flour is poured into, one Kohen to make the Kmitza, and one Kohen to hold the Keli while the Kmitza is happening. Amar Lei, so Rab Nachman said, so big deal. What's the big deal? So you need more Kohanim. We know that when you bring the Karban Tamid, there were 13 Kohanim involved in its process. So yeah, maybe there were more Kohanim involved to hold the Keli while the Kmitza was being done. Gewalt, sagt die Gemara weiter. Eisvei. Zakla. We're talking, this Brisa is talking about Pigel. And we know that during any avoida of consequence, if you have a machshavas Pigel, it will passel the carbon. So, what are the avoidance of consequence by the mincha? Zakla. Kol ha-koimetz, v'noisen b'chli, ha-moilech, the one who brings it to the Mizbeach, the Amakter and the one who puts the Kmitza on the Mizbeach, if he did it with the Kavana of a Lechel Dover Shadake Lechel, Chut Lizmane or Chut Lim Kaimoi, that is going to be Pigel. So, which are the critical avoiders? The one who does the Kmitza, the one who places it in the Keli, the one who delivers it, and the one who's Makter it. Rashi is going to tell us on number base that these 4 avoiders are connected the avoid of dam. The kaimet is like the person who makes the shchita. The noisim bekli is like the person who made the kabbalah sadam. Hamoilach is just like the moilach dam. You're taking it over to the mizbeach, and the amakter is parallel to the zrika sadam. So these are the 4 critical avoiders by a mincha. But according to you, Rab Nachman, who it's also critical for a kohen to be holding the container while this is happening. Why isn't there a machshavas pigel if the kohen holding the vessel during these avoiders? If he had a machshavas pigel, wouldn't that also make it pigel? Because that's an integral part of the avodah. Vila magbia like a tani. Zok Gemara, you know why? Tana avodas nokat. V'loi say to kahana. The discussion here is the avoiders that could the avoiders that could cause it to become pigel, but we're not getting into the detail of how many kohanim are needed for each avodah. Any kohen that's required in each stage, yes, could make it pigel. The reason why the Tana doesn't explicitly list all those kohanim is because that's not the focus of the brisa. The focus of the brisa is just to tell us which avodas are the ones that are susceptible to pigel. You want to drill down into the details of each avodah, that was not within the scope of what the Tana was teaching us. But avada, any kohen involved in any one of these steps, even if they're merely holding the klesharis, if they're a machshavas pigel, it would pass all the carbon. Boy b'nim b'darb ma'u likmoitz mikli shal gabi karka. This almost sounds like the same shaila we had earlier, but I guess this shaila was asked by Reb Sheshes. Can you make a kmitza out of a keli that's not being held by a kohen? It's sitting on the ground. Amar lei, so Reb Sheshes said, Puk chazi ma'avdin lagav. Why don't you go look and see what they did in the Beis Hamikdash? Now, of course, in the days of Reb Sheshes, there was no Beis Hamikdash. He meant look up the Mishnayos that describe how it was done. So the Mishnah is discussing the processing of the lechem aponim on Shabbos. They would bring in a new set of lechem aponim, 12 breads, with 2 bazich halavoina, and they would swap out. They would take the 12 breads from the shulchan, the Shnei Bezich Levonim from the Shulchan, and they would swap it out. So this is how it was done. Arba Kayhanim Nichnasim. 4 Kayhanim came in to the Heichal, and this is what each of them were carrying. Shnayim biyodam beisedarim. 2 of the Kayhanim each held 6 breads, right? One for each half of the Shulchan. Ushnayim biyodam shnei bazich. And the other 2 Kayhanim, each one held 1 container of levina. The arba mekadbin lefneim. Before these 4 Kayhanim come into the Heichal, there's actually 4 Kayhanim that went there before to dismantle the breads from last week. Shnayim lita al shnei sedorim. 2 Kayhanim to take the 2 piles of bread. Ubeis lita bazich. Problem is, you can't just take it off the shulchan or just put it on the shulchan, because if you're telling me that a mincha cannot be taken from the floor, it has to be taken from the hands of the kayhanim, wouldn't you have need more kayhanim to lift up the shulchan while this was happening? It doesn't mention that you needed a kohen to lift up the shulchan. So it's a raya that you could make, and now we know that the lechem aponim was exactly like the mincha. We consider it like a regular mincha, and the kmitza, connected the kmitza of a mincha, is the bezicha levoina of the lechem aponim. So basically, we learn from here that for a mincha, it could be sitting on the ground or on a table. It doesn't have to be held by a kohen. Zok to Gemara, I don't understand what you're asking me. A second ago, you asked me a similar kasha from a different brayso of Pigel. And what did I answer? Lav amrit hasam seder avodas nakat, hachanami seder avodas nakat. The Mishnah is just giving us the chronology of how the process worked. It's not giving us the details of how many kahanim are involved. Frank Gemara, here you can't say that, Teretz. Midami. Hasam le'nachas l'minyani de kahanim. Yes, in the Brayso of Pigel, it just lists off avodah. It doesn't talk about how many kahanim are involved in each step. But in this Brayso that's talking about the lechem aponim, it's telling us you need 4 kahanim and 4 kahanim. You don't need 4 kahanim, you need 5 kahanim or 6 kahanim. So hacha nachas l'minyani de kahanim. Imisa, if in fact you need more kahanim to lift up the shulchan when they're doing this avodah, listi magbia. El shmamina kaimsin michli shal gabi karka shmamina. So he brings a raya from here, not like Rab Nachman concluded that the kohen has to be holding it. Rather, here you have a raya that it doesn't have to be held, even if the keli with the mincha is on the floor and the kohen made the kmitza out of it. That would be a good kmitza, which is consistent with how we started this whole sugya. That's why the Gemara didn't answer that the kmitza was done on the keli on the floor, because that would be a perfectly good kmitza. Omar Rava pshitali. I've just been poished due to the above discussion that when the kohen makes the kmitza, the keli can be on the floor. It doesn't have to be held by another kohen. Shekein matinu b'siluk b'zicha. That's what we just proved from the lechem aponim. It was done without anybody lifting up the shulchan. We also know that mekachin mincha v'chli shalgabe karka. When you originally placed the flour into the keli, it could also be a keli on the floor. It doesn't have to be held by a kohen. Shekein matzinu b'sider bezichin, because when they put the bezichin on the shulchan, that's like preparing the mincha. Again, nobody was holding the shulchan. But there's one case that we haven't discussed yet. Boy Rava, what about kiddush kohenets? Now, by a mincha, after the kohen takes the kmitza out of the main container, he puts it into another container. That second container does not have to be held by a kohen. Now, why don't you know it from the lechem aponim? The teretz is because what is the kohen by the lechem aponim? The bezicha levoina. The bezicha levoina aren't placed into a keli. They just take them directly to the mizbeach. So we don't have a parallel. We've been learning all of our halachas from the lechem aponim, but there's no parallel to placing the kmitza into a klei sharis. There's no parallel by the lechem aponim, because the bezicha levoina, when they were taken off the shulchan, were not placed into anything. They went directly to the mizbeach. So the question is, mi mincha yafinala? Do we learn it out of mincha, and it should be like the other parts of the mincha where it does not have to be held by a kohen? Or maybe midam yafinala, because we're saying placing the kmitza into the klei sharis is keneged the kabbalas adam. by Kabbalah Saddam, we know the kohen has to be holding the keli. You can't just put a keli on the floor, shecht an animal, and let the blood run into the keli. A kohen has to be holding that keli. So maybe huadin, we learn from dam that the kohen has to be holding the keli that the kmitza is placed into. Hadar pasha. Then Rava was pasha the shayla, and he said, "Mi dam yalfinin law." We learn it from dam, and therefore that particular avoida, when you place the kmitza into the keli, that keli does need to be held by a kohen. Did Rava say this? But Rava taught us another halacha which contradicts this. You had a kaimitz that was split into two kelim, meaning you're supposed to put the whole kmitza into one kelim. You put it into two kelim. Now, what about dam? We learned that when you mekabel the dam, you have to be mekabel all of the dam in one kelim. You can't be mekabel half of the dam in one keli, half in the other keli, unless each keli has enough to do all the zrika. But if one keli does not have enough to do all the zrika is required, that's possible. You have to have all of the dam has to be able to be niskabel in one keli, so that in one keli of all the dam that will be required for all of the matnas dam. So, Zok to Gemara, what about a koimitz that you split in half? Half of one keli, half of another keli. It's not kaddish. It's not a good Kabbalah. I'm calling it Kabbalah because that's the parallel avoided by a carbon. But Rava Amar kaddish, it is kaddish. Freit the Gemara of him, Isa, if you hold Rava learns halachas and a mincha from dam, leilach midam. Why doesn't Rava also agree to Rav Nachman that it's in a kaddish, just like dam, half the blood in one keli, half the blood in the other keli, would not be a good Kabbalah? So too by the mincha, it shouldn't be a good Kabbalah when you put half the kmitza in one keli and half in another keli. Zok Gemara, you're right. Hadur be Rava meyahi. Rava actually backed off from this halacha that he said that it's kadosh, and he holds not kadosh because he holds you actually do learn mincha from dam, and therefore A is a kohen has to be holding the keli when you put the kmitza into it, and B, if you only put half the kmitza into one keli and half the kmitza into the other keli, it would not be kosher. We're basing it all that by dam, if you weren't mekabel all of the blood required in one keli, it wouldn't be a good kabbalah sadam. How do we know that? The Tani Rab Tachlich ben Shol, and this is Chazorah, we learned this already in Tzvachim. Kidesh pachos michtei hazah bechliseh. You have two kelim, and neither keli has enough blood in it to fulfill all of the zrika requirements of that particular carbon. Like Kiddush, it's not a good Kabbalah, and this carbon is possible. But the Gemara is Shaila. B'dam, I apologize. The case that I just quoted, Kiddush pachas mechtei hazah b'chlizeh, or pachas mechtei b'chlizeh, is not talking about dam of a carbon. It's speaking about the water of the paraduma. If you didn't have enough water in either keli, and you put ashes into each one, will that be a kosher mechatos for the paraduma, or it's too late? Either it is kosher, you just mix it together, and now you're fine. Or you say no, once it wasn't done originally with the right purport, with the right shear, it's going to be possible. And the Gemara said over there that the halacha is it's possible. The Gemara wants to know, what about by Kabbalah's dam? Would it have the same restriction as paraduma? And what is the shaila? Do you say hilchasahi? Do you say the reason why this is not kosher for the paraduma is because it's halacha l'moshe b'sinai? And if that's the case, we wouldn't be able to draw a parallel to Kabbalah's dam, because halacha l'moshe b'sinai that was stated by paraduma did not necessarily apply, will not necessarily apply to dam. Or maybe look at it from a different perspective. My time up. The reasoning, the makar of this halacha by paraduma is not halacha l'moshe, it's vidarshan from the words of the pasuk. The chsiv v'taval b'mayim. You should be toivel in the water. What do I mean in the water? In the full amount of water that's required for this avodah. If that is the reasoning behind paraduma, well, we have a similar nusach in the parsha of Zrikas Dam. Hachanami Bedama says v'taval badam, and v'taval badam means in all of the blood that's there for the entire task. V'itmar Amar Zrika, Amar Belozer. Af bedam loy kidesh. Rabbi Zrika said that by dam as well, half and half, it wouldn't work because it's not Allah Moshe Mashinai. We learn it out of the pasuk v'tovel badam. We actually have a brisa that teaches us this exact halach. It says v'toval, the kohen has to dip his finger into the keli where there's dam at the bottom of it that he can dip his finger into. V'loy masvig. But what if there's dam on the walls of the keli? He can't use his finger like a spatula and wipe up the blood from the walls of the keli and use that to make zrika. The zrika has to be by dipping his finger into the pool of dam at the bottom. That's what we learn from v'toval. Badam, and here's our halacha, shehei badam shir tefillah meikar. There has to be a shir tefillah meikar, meaning there has to be enough dam in the keli to be able to supply enough dam for all of the required zrika activities of this particular part. Then it says min adam. What do we learn from min adam? We learn min adam shebe'inyin. We're going to leave that for now. The Gemara is going to explain what that means later. Now we're focused on v'tovel v'lei masbig badom shehei badam shir tefillah. V'yitzrich l'michtav v'tovel v'yitzrich l'michtav badam. These are two different limudim, v'tovel and badam, and they're both very necessary, so we get the full picture of what the requirements are. If the Torah only says v'tovel, havamina aval gav lo kibul shir tefillah, even if there's not enough dam in the keli for all the zrikas, it would still be fine. It's just telling you that you have to dip your finger into the bottom. You can't wipe it off the sides. So therefore, badam, to tell you that there has to be enough dam there from the beginning. The tavel, the first tefillah that you're making to start your zrika, has to be badam in the dam where there's enough of dam for the whole avodah. Because of badam, you could even wipe it off the sides of the keli because of a Beautiful. So this is how we know that there has to be enough dam in the keli for all of the zrikas. And Rava says that halacha you could pass on to mincha. Therefore, by the kmitza as well. We know two halachas. A is that you can't split up the kmitza. The whole kmitza has to go into one klisharis. And B is a kohen has to be holding the klisharis that the kmitza is placed into. Zok to Gemara, what does it mean adam shabe'inyan? Lamute mai, amarav lamute shirayim shabe'etzba. What happens is the kohen dips his finger into the blood and he makes one zrika. But there's still dam left on his finger. Can he make the second zrika with the dam that's on his finger? The loch is no. He has to wipe it off and dip it again. So every zrika that he makes, he has to dip his finger into the dam again. He can't just use the residual dam that's still on his finger. So the mutish ram shebetzba. So Akmar misayei le Rabbi Lazar. This is a right to Rabbi Lazar. The Omar shirayim shebetzba psulim. Even the shirayim on your finger is possible. Omar le Rabin bar Rav Adal Rava. Amri talmidcha Omar Rav Amram. Your Talmud Rav Amram, either your Talmud Rav Amram said or your Talmud tells the name of Rav Amram. Tanya, do you have a following brisa? Hayamasa. We know the halacha is if dam falls on a beged, you have to wash the beged out. But that's only dam that you could make zrika with. So what if you were spritzing dam, and the blood spritzed from your hand and it went on a beged? If you didn't make a zrika yet, ton kibos. That dam is dam that's royu to make zrika on, so therefore you have to wash it out of any beged that it's in. But mishahiza, once he spritzed and now dam dripped off his finger after he already spritzed, ain ton kibos. That doesn't need kibos. So Zok to Gemara, my love, what does that mean? Achaloi Gomer has a asay. Pashas, what it means is, let's say you have to give 5 zrikas, right? We'll say, as long as you didn't do all 5 zrikas, if any dam dripped off his finger onto a beged, that beged needs to be washed. So Shema Mina, the Shiraim Shabbat Paksherim. If you're going to tell me that if I didn't finish all my zrikas, even though I did one zrika from this finger, dam that drips off of it will still require to be washed out, that means it's royal zrika. So from there you should have a riot, the opposite of what we're saying. And that is that Shiraim Shabbat are kosher. So that's not how you need to read the brisa. Rather, loy, achela yotza miyodoi, zot on kibbutz. You dip your finger into dam, before you spritz anywhere, if it went on a beged, it needs kibbutz. But once you made that one zrika with that one dip, any residual dam on your finger is not royal for zrika, and therefore, if it fell on a beged, it would not need kibbutz. And then when it's a mimashanisser on his finger, ain't ton kibbutz, because it's one dip per one zrika. Zok Gemara. Another challenge. Esve Abaye. Goma milahazos. Now we're talking about the zrika sadam of the par aduma. So he finished making the zrika. His hands are full of blood. Mekaneach yodoi begufo shapara. That's when he wipes his hands off on the goof of the par. That means you don't have to wipe it off in between zrikas, only when he's finished all the zrikas. Gomer in like gomer loy. So you have a raya, in fact, that all the dam on his finger is going to be royal zrika, even though he already made his rika with that time. Amalei, he answered, no. Gomar mekanech yodai. When he's totally finished, he should wipe off his entire hands with dam to get it all onto the behema, and they burn it with the behema. But loy gomar, if he's still in the middle of the zrikas, mekanech it's boy, he still has to wipe off his finger in between each zrika, because once he made zrika with the dam on his finger, he cannot reuse it. So I understand why when he's finished the whole seder zrika, he has to wipe his hands off and all the blood from his hands onto the para. He has to burn the whole para, including the blood. He's got to get it all off on the para. Ella loy gomar mekanech boy. If he didn't finish yet, why does he have to? If he's going to wipe off his finger in between each rika, what's he supposed to wipe it off? So you might ask, what do you mean? What's he supposed to wipe it off? And the behema, right? When he's finished all his rika, you wipe his hands off on the behema. So on each finger, as he does each rika, what's the Gemara asking b'may mekanech? So there's actually two pshatim in this kasha. Rashi here has one shot, and we learned this Gemara in Zvachim. Rashi there is a different shot. Over here, Rashi says something interesting, that the place where they shechted the animal, this paraduma, and where they burnt it, is not the place where this rika was done. So they would shech the animal lower on the mountain. The kohen would be mekabel the dam. He'd walk higher up the mountain, and he would make this rika up there. So the Gemara is saying over here, Bishlam, when he finishes everything, so he's walking down the mountain anyway to burn it, so when he gets there, he'll wipe his hands off. But between each rika to go up and down the mountain each time to wipe his finger off on the animal, that's not practical. That's how Rashi learns over here. Rashi in Zvachim learned you can't wipe your finger off on the animal, because what's going to happen is there'll be fibers and hair from the animal to get on your finger, and the next rika is going to have hair on it. It's not nice to do the avodah that way. So in Tosfos points out that Rashi in Zvachim explained this a little bit differently than Rashi here. But either way, the question is, how does he wipe off his finger if the animal's not there, or if he can't wipe it off on the animal? You have a mizrach here, let's say this cup, your finger is dripping blood, you could just wipe your finger off on the rim of the keli and get rid of the extra blood. In the Navi, which is in Ezra, the Navi refers to the keli that holds the dam, the kapoire. Kapoire means a kapoire is a washer. Why is a keli that holds dam considered a washer, a wiper? It's because it's also used, it's a dual purpose. Besides the fact that it's holding blood, you're also rubbing your finger off and getting the excess blood off your finger by rubbing it on the rim of the keli. Zokt Gemara, did Rabbi Elazar actually say this? Did Rabbi Elazar actually say this? Via Itmar, we had a machlokes. So who is Rabbi Elazar here? 1 second. Who is Rabbi Elazar over here? Where is our Rabbi Elazar? Let's see. Af bedam loy kidesh l'chatzai. No, it was Rabbi Elazar up here. Trying to find a Rebbe Elazar over here. Here it is. Amar Blazer af bedam aloy kidesh. Rabbi Blazer said not only does this halacha apply to the paraduma water, it also applies to dam. So fact Gemara, mi Amar Rabbi Blazer achi, did Rabbi Blazer say this? Well, itmar chavite kohen gadol. The chavitna of the kohen gadol every day brought a mincha. The full mincha was an isarin, but they didn't bring it all at one time. They brought half of an isarin in the morning and half of an isarin in the afternoon. But when it was presented originally, it had to come together. So Chavidi Kohen Gadol, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Einoi Kedusha Lechatzoyin. When we want to be makdish to mincha, even though you're only being makriv half at a time, to be makdish the whole mincha, you have to bring it together one yisarin in the keli. That's the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan. But Rabbi Elazar Amar Mitoich Shekarv Lechatzoyin Kedusha Lechatzoyin. No, since you're going to be makriv each half a yisarin by itself, so therefore you could also be makdish a half of a yisarin because the Torah, the way the Torah lays out the carbon, it's a half of a shard at a time. It's not one big carbon. If you're going to say that you learn mincha from dam, and by dam you can't do half at a time, so Rabbi Lozer, who says that by dam you can't be makabel half the dam at a time, he should also apply that to the mincha, that you cannot do half at a time. And if you're going to tell me that Rabbi Elazar is not going to learn mincha from dam, we know he does. Because the Amar Rabbi Elazar, mincha shekamta behechel kshera. How does he know that a kamitza done in the hechel is kosher? Shekei matino b'siluk b'zichan, which are done in the hechel. Zok to Gemara, mincha mi mincha yalef. He'll learn one mincha from another mincha. He'll learn the regular mincha from the mincha of the melechem aponim. But mincha midam lo yalef, but he won't learn mincha from dam. And just because dam has to be niskabel in one keli, the minchas chavitin does not necessarily have to be that way. Okay, we'll stop here, Bez Hashem. We will continue Bez Hashem tomorrow.